So it's time for my sowing and growing guide for September and October. You can find all the details of these months and all previous months and last year's months in the reference information section of my ebook, and you can find a link to that down below. So I'm looking at my iPad, and the database that I'm looking at is also linked down below, so you can follow along if you can't catch any of the names and things of the varieties that I'm talking about, or any of the other information that I'll display down the side of the screen, or that side of the screen, whichever one it is. First up on the list is Toughball. I've already sown one batch of Toughball a few weeks ago, and they've germinated quite nicely. And it's worth sowing a couple of batches if you've got the space, just because of the sensitivity really of overwintered onions to go into seed. If you sow them too early, then they go to seed, and if you sow them too late, they're not really strong enough to get through winter. It's a bit tricky because you don't really know whether it's going to be too early or too late, because the weather conditions will vary from year to year. So 2 batches gives you the best chance. I'm sowing mine this year a little bit later than in previous years, because I think it's generally getting warmer, and as a result the tendency for them to go to seed is getting worse, and therefore slightly later sowing seems to be a good idea. Next up is winter miners lettuce. I've got a lot of that sowing already. The stuff that I sowed back in August is the stuff that's going outside, and it'll grow outside all of its life. And the stuff that I'm going to sow at the beginning of September is the batch that's going to go into the polytunnel. Now, the reason for doing some in the polytunnel is partly just so we have a continuous supply. If it's frozen outside, it won't be frozen in the polytunnel, but also I think there'll be less cleanup associated with it when it's grown in the polytunnel. And miners lettuce is one of those things that takes a little bit of time to clean up. And then we're going to be loads of successions of spinach. What I'm trying to achieve with the spinach is a nice constant harvest volume. And so if I planted all the spinach that I need to be eating in December and January, for example, as one batch, then I'd have a massive glut of it in autumn, and it would also all go to seed at the same time. So by sowing kind of a batch every 2 weeks or so, I gradually sort of build up the volume as the harvest rate is reducing into autumn and winter. And the other reason for it is it just means that I get to clear my beds progressively on the allotment, and the spinach generally follows the peppers, and so it means I can keep peppers in the ground a bit longer. I'm growing Giant Winter. It's my favourite of the winter spinaches. It does just really well for me, but lots of people, there's loads of different spinaches. People have different successes with different ones. Doing the last batch of radish. Radish growth rate really does slow down in October, and so I don't really find there's much benefit in sowing it much later than sort of early September sort of time. You can push it a little bit, but generally there's a better crop to use that space for. And one of those better crops are salad onions. So this is my last batch, I think, of salad onions. I've sown absolutely loads. I've got about 1,500 of them growing at the moment, because we eat loads of salad onions a day, like 10 a day or something like that. And obviously you're going to be eating these all the way through until May. They will be pretty big by May. And so a few later batches gives you some slightly smaller ones as we get into spring. And then also my first batch for next year, I actually generally do it in December, and it just gives me a little bit of an earlier harvest and takes up a little bit less space. Then I've got a whole load of lettuces. So these are the lettuces that will go into the polytunnel. If you've got a polytunnel, I do highly recommend that you put your lettuces as a priority in the polytunnel, because they just do so much better. Same would be true of a greenhouse. Low tunnels and cold frames, I find I get quite a lot of losses in those to stem rot, and that's just generally because of drips from the lids, and those drips hitting the lettuces and just causing a high humidity environment and just causes stem rot. So, again, your mileage might vary, but for me, middle of September is about the perfect time to do lettuces for the polytunnel. I'll be planting those out about October the 10th or thereabouts, and so I'll be eating those in November. And I'm doing Brighton, Flashy Butter Oak, Roxy, Really Red Deer Tongue, and Grenoble Red and Riccia. And to complement the lettuces in the salads, but we also use for cooking, I'm doing red pak choi, red stem pak choi, and tat soy, and I might do a bit of Mizuna, but I've already done quite a bit of Mizuna, so I might not do any more. And salad rocket, and that'll pretty much make up most of the stuff that goes in leafy greens, at least, that go into the salads, and all of those will go into the polytunnel. And more giant winter, and yet more giant winter, and then start with the overwintered brassicas. So overwintered brassicas is a really nice technique, especially if you leave them on a shelf in the greenhouse or the polytunnel, and they just keep them nice and moist, but they don't really need any attention other than perhaps being potted on once, all the way through until planting time, which is generally late January, February or early March, depending on the succession. And the beauty of having them in pots in the polytunnel or the greenhouse, or even a cold frame, I suppose, is that you're just using up very little space for them. And that means you can use the bed space in the ground for more valuable crops like lettuce and spinach, for example, and onions and salad onions and the like. And then as you start to clear your beds in February and March, you can plant these overwintered brassicas and harvest them effectively as if you'd planted them in the ground in, say, October time. So I really like it as a technique. I'm doing Calabrese marathon and Orkney cauliflower, and I think I'm also doing, although it doesn't seem to be on the list at the moment, Brussels sprouts, which I'll be growing for leaves. I have a whole video series and a chapter in my ebook about why I grow Brussels sprouts for leaves, but it's partly just because they're super tasty, really prolific, and they just give you a really great harvest of leaves initially, then the sprout tops, then the actual sprouts in summer. And they're my favourite of the brassicas to be harvested in summer and also autumn and winter. So finally for September, we've got another batch of Brighton lettuce, and there's a late batch of Brighton lettuce and an earlier batch, so two batches, because I like to let it heart up. It's one of the few lettuces that I actually leave to heart up. And so those are the lettuces that will be harvesting sort of January, early February sort of time. That is when lettuce volumes, harvest volumes are at their absolute lowest. So it's nice to have a few hearted up lettuces at that time. And of course, then I can clear those and get those beds replanted with something else in February, probably some of those Calabrese or cauliflower that I just mentioned, but there's lots of other alternatives. And then a final batch of giant winter spinach. So let's take a look at October. Now, I always say in this, when I'm doing this video series, the guide for October is always kind of a rough guide. So I don't really do my final planning until a few days before the start of the month and the making of this video. So I just sort of sketch out roughly the sorts of stuff I'm going to be doing in October and roughly the sorts of times I'm going to be doing it. But we'll probably start pea shoots. Quite like to do pea shoots on the windowsill because the peas will be coming to an end by then. And it's nice to have a bit of a taste of peas in the salad mixes. And Debbie also likes to cook with them, put them in soups and things, and stir fries and the like. And then there'll be another batch of Calabrese cauliflowers and Brussels sprouts for leaves. And it's worth having these small successions, so only sort of 5 or 6 plants in a succession, because they will come to maturity a few weeks apart. Otherwise you just get all your cauliflowers and all your calabrese at the same time, which is not an issue if you like to freeze them and eat from the freezer, but or pretty much everything we eat is fresh, so we like multiple successions. And then we come to the field beans. So field beans are one of my favourite winter crops. If you ever had the tips of broad beans, which you often take off to avoid the black fly in spring, then you'll know what what field bean tips are like. But the difference is that you're generally pinching the tips out of your broad beans when they're sort of this sort of height, whereas with field beans you're pinching the tips out when they're only sort of 4 to 6 inches tall, the plants, and then they send up new shoots from the base, and so you're always eating these really fresh, high quality, tightly sort of bound leaves that are in the growing tip, and you kind of every 3 weeks or so you sort of take another tip, and then the plant will sort of throw up another one, and then you take another tip and it'll throw up another one and you take another tip. But the tips are really great. So the leaves on these field beans, the mature leaves, can get a bit sad over winter basically, but the new growing tips are always in perfect condition. So that's part of the reason I like it. The other reason I like it is because it's a complement to spinach. So you can pretty much use field bean tips in any recipe that you would otherwise use spinach. And it's lower in oxalic acid, and it just adds a bit of extra variety to your diet. We're always trying to get like 30 different types of food harvested each week, and so field bean tips are great, and also really prolific. So it's a really nice complement to spinach. I'm going to do essentially 2 batches of field beans, one outside and one in the cold frame. The one outside will do okay just before winter, and it'll do okay in sort of late February and March and into April. And the one that I'm doing in one of my cold frames, or a low tunnel, I'm not sure which yet, hopefully that will do okay through winter itself. A lot of things basically stop growing right in the middle of winter, so late December and through January and early February. So that period of time, you're really mainly eating things that have already grown. So if you want things to keep on growing, they've really got to be under cover and have maximum amount of light. And so I find that field beans under cover are one of those things that keep on growing, as do lettuces and spinach and things like that, but only slowly. So you need a lot of space dedicated to those things, and that's why it's important to build up the volume so you don't have these huge gluts in autumn. And that's also why it's really important to clear your beds really rapidly, because if you've got, I don't know, let's say I might have 6 square meters of spinach in the middle of winter, which is just enough to meet the family's needs, but by the end of February, early March, that's maybe twice as much as we need, and then by late March it's 3 times as much as we need, and probably by the fact that by early April it's 4 times as much as we need. So you need to really keep clearing your beds as you're going through sort of February, March and early April, and replanting with additional crops. So that's the way you really got to do gardening in winter. You've got to really be mindful of these varying growth rates and how to manage your beds to get maximum throughput. Then we've got green garlic, and I'm doing 2 batches of green garlic as well. I'm doing one set that'll germinate in modules and I'll grow on in the conservatory into reasonably sized plants, and I'll plant those out in the polytunnel for an early crop of green garlic. Green garlic is just ordinary garlic, it's just harvested green. And by green, what I mean is I'm harvesting the whole of the stem and the monobulb. It won't have split into cloves at that point. And I've got my very distracting cat down here now, who's getting tangled up with my cables. Yeah, and so it's a fantastic crop because it comes well, as much as 2 months earlier than your main crop garlic harvest. And so that it tastes quite like garlic. It's still got a good garlic taste to it, but it's very sweet, and the stems are a bit like a leek. So I think of it as a sort of garlicky sweet leek, and I really like it, and everybody seems to like it, to be honest. So we grow quite a lot of it, probably somewhere in the region of 15 bulbs, 150 cloves of it, and that sees us through that 2-month period. By that time, we're generally a bit short of stored garlic, so it just sees us through that transition. And then I'm also doing elephant garlic, and again I'm doing elephant garlic for 2 reasons: partly to grow the really big cloves which we roast, and partly to harvest some of it for its big stems. And elephant garlic is from the leek family, and the stems are a pretty good substitute for leeks. And we generally have run out of leeks sort of in the April period, and so again green garlic gives us a sort of leek alternative in April and May. So yeah, lots of playing around here. I cover all this, of course, in my ebook. You can find that down below. And then my main crop garlic, of course, will be planted out. All of that will just go into the ground, sort of mid-October sort of time. Then another succession of calabrese, Brussels sprouts for leaves, and cauliflowers. I'm just doing Orkney for the cauliflowers this year, a good overwintering variety. And then we come to the carrots. Now, I love winter carrots, always raving about winter carrots and spring carrots, and the reason because they respond so nicely to the frost. It really sweetens them up. They're so much better than a carrot in summer and early autumn. We leave them in the ground. We do take the tops off them and sort of leave about that much leaf, and then that regrows with nice fresh leaf growth. And I generally put a cold frame top over them just so they don't freeze, but you could use all sorts of fleece or something like that. Then I harvest every other row, and in the gaps between the rows then I'll plant spinach or pak choi or tatsoi or something like that in sort of late winter, early spring. And so I'll keep on harvesting then the carrots all the way through until generally about April time. Might be the beginning of April, might be the middle of April. I might harvest a whole batch of them and store them in compost just for the last few weeks of April, and then we'll start eating the Napoli carrots that we sow in late October, and we'll overwinter those in the polytunnel in containers, and so we'll start harvesting those in early May basically. And I'll do another batch probably of Napoli and or Marion in November, and they're the ones we'll be eating in June. And then by the time we get to sort of late June, early July, we'll be eating the ones that we started in March. So yeah, some more peas, and then we'll go on to our broad beans. And again, I'm doing 2 batches of broad beans. I do start them all in modules because we don't need a huge number. And just more reliable to start them in modules, I think. One batch will go into a large container in the polytunnel, and they're the ones we'll be eating really early, I think sort of sometime in April probably. And then we'll get the second batch that we'll put outside. They're the ones that come about 3 weeks later or thereabouts. And then I'll have another couple of successions just so we get a nice steady supply of broad beans until we get the French beans, and then the runner beans, and then the climbing French beans, and we just keep on going. So that, I think, is pretty much it for what I'm sowing and in September and October. My name's Steve. This is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.